to record. All right, so I'm going to introduce you to Karen McHugh. She has been doing this analysis of action documents for the program, for MKS program, and she will be giving you her main findings and how you can actually integrate these findings in the courses and training events that we are doing at MKS. So I'm giving the floor over to Karen right now.
Okay, and Karen is pressing on talk. I hope everyone can hear me. Oops, and on video, yes. Okay, there I am. Hello, everybody. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, everybody. This is a first for me, so bear with me if there are some... you can't see me, can you not? Oh, let me check. Can you see me now? Okay, okay, you can see me there. Okay, yes, as I was saying, it's the first time, so there will be a few hiccups along the way. Basically, as Lucy just said, I carried out an analysis, a pretty detailed analysis of 31 action documents. One way or another, all of us are going to be working with action documents, so we thought it would be useful to share the findings, the overall findings from this analysis and some of the more detailed findings. I know you have different interests given on your own areas of expertise, so we're going to make this as interactive as possible, but obviously it becomes a little bit difficult if everybody's chatting at the same time. So what we'll do, as we said, we're going to break it down into 3 sessions. So first of all, I'm just going to run through the methodology. How did we do this? What was the sample, etc., and some of the general findings. Then we will take a break to give you the opportunity to ask some questions. I'll then look into more detail at some of the different sections of the action document template or findings from the action document template. So to that end, I do recommend that, can you see me there, by the way? That video seems to have gone down again. Okay, let me see. Okay, sorry guys, I don't know why the video is... Oh, Blackboard Collaborate has encountered an exception is showing up on my screen here. Let's see if we can muddle through. Okay, yep, okay, seems to be back. Okay, so what I would ask you, sorry about this guys, what I would ask you is to have certain documents to hand if possible, in particular the instructions template which we sent out by email, because I will refer to it, it'll just make the discussion a little bit easier. So I will be looking at the findings from sections 1 and 2 of the action document template, then sections 3 and 4, and we'll take a break after each of those sessions. Okay, so let's get started. I will now discuss a little bit the background to this assessment. So I keep getting a message on my screen here that the video is not running. Yeah. Okay. So basically, as I said, I looked at 31 action documents, and the assignment, what we were trying to do was to assess the degree of conformity between the instructions for action document template and completion of action documents. So I think it's important to bear in mind that I wasn't actually assessing the quality of the actions themselves, but rather the degree to which EU staff were following the instructions in the template. Now, there is obviously a discussion to be had about whether a high quality action document will lead to a higher quality action or vice versa, but that is a discussion for another day. For the moment, we are just literally looking at the conformity and consistency between the action documents that I revised and the instructions in the template. Okay, so how did we go about this? How did I go about it? Each action document was assessed section by section for conformity with the instructions as they currently stand in the guidance document. Now, the first thing that we have to point out is that if you look at page 3 of the instructions for action document template completion, you will see that there are several columns. So there's a certain amount of information that is requested during the identification stage. That's your first column. In the second column, there is a certain amount of information requested during the formulation stage. Obviously, more information is required in the formulation stage. So depending on whether it's an initial action document, i.e. during identification phase, or a final action document in formulation phase, the amount of information requested will vary. So, for example, we also have 2 types of action, obviously project modality and budget support modality. So all in all, we have 4 types of AD. We have project modality full action document, we have project modality initial action document, and the same for budget support. Okay, so if this is a little bit strange, as I said, it's the first time I've done it, I can't see anyone, I can't tell if you're understanding me as I'm going along, but I shall carry on and we will have an opportunity to ask questions. So the important thing is, for the project modality full action documents, I looked at 12 sections plus the LFM. For project modality initial, i.e. in the identification phase, I looked at 9 sections. Budget support, there are 16. You have 4 additional ones in the case of budget support, and in the case of initial budget support action documents, you have 13 sections. So let us see. It was a pretty straightforward mechanical exercise. The decision was, does the information provided in the action document comply with instructions? Does it, if not, does it partially comply with instructions, or does it not comply with instructions? They were the 3 options. For each of the sections of the action document, I pulled out an example of sort of full consistency and non-consistency, just to give comparisons. That's a separate document which we will be discussing a little bit later. So if you look at the 31 action documents that were analyzed, they have 9 sections, or what I end up actually calling criteria, in common. First of all, we have section 1.1. I don't know how familiar you all are with action documents, but I will go through sort of the basics of it. 1.1 is the sector, country, or regional context, sort of the broader context within which the action is taking place. 1.1.1, public policy assessment and the EU policy framework. Then stakeholder analysis, then priority areas for support, problem analysis. They're all part of the sort of contextual analysis section. Section 2 is risks and assumptions. Section 3 comprises lessons learned, complementarity, synergy and coordination, and cross-cutting issues. And finally, 4.1, objectives, results and options. And then we looked at the LFMs, or in the case of budget support, an indicative list of result indicators. Those of you who are familiar with the action document will see that there are indeed sections missing, but that was done on purpose. We tried to really zoom in on the areas where we felt more instruction or more guidance was required. So, for example, everything to do with section 5, which is implementation modalities, was not looked into. Okay, so moving on now from methodology. Yes, that's what I was saying. Full documents have additional information. So here you are going into more detail. You're going into more detail about activities, and this is where the intervention logic comes in, section 4.3. And as I mentioned very briefly, budget support actions have an additional 4 sections. For those of you familiar with budget support operations, you will recognize them immediately: fundamental values, macroeconomic policy, BFM, and transparency and budget oversight. And basically, because I work on monitoring and evaluation, we also decided to include section 5.8 of the action document to have a look at what was going on there. So, hi Geraldo, I see you have just joined the session. Is everything going fine technically, Lucy? Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Right, so here is the sample. We have 31 documents in total. As I said, we looked at a sample of project modality and budget support, and we looked at both types, so full action documents and initial documents. So in total, project modality, we looked at 24 action documents, and budget support 7, so more of a focus really on project modality, and equally more focus on full action documents, i.e. final action documents after the formulation phase rather than initial. So 24 full action documents and 7 initial action documents. Hi Alex. I just see names popping up here, so I'm saying hello. Okay. Moving on, so just very quickly, just to give you an idea, it was broken down by sectors. This is the sample, you know, more or less 3 or 4 action documents per sector, so it's all pretty balanced, with perhaps a slight preponderance of rural development, food security. If I recollect correctly, we had about 6 action documents in that sector. Okay, and then budget varied quite a bit. I suppose in the majority of the action documents covered operations within the sort of 5 to 20 million euro budget range, so in that range there. Okay, so excuse me. Moving on now to what were the general findings. Overall, what was the quality or the degree of consistency and coherence of action documents? In fact, what we discovered was very few action documents in the sample actually managed to create the logical links that you would expect between the different sections of the document. So instead of presenting information in sort of a logical sequence as required by the layout of the template for filling the action document, it was quite disjointed. Certain sections appeared to be completed in isolation. There wasn't sort of joined up thinking, let's put it like that. And I will give some examples of that in a little while. So that, let's say, was the overall finding with regard to the overall consistency and coherence of action documents, that it sort of lacked that pulling together of the information. So what sort of inconsistencies did we find? There's sort of a breakdown here. We found information was provided, but often in the wrong section. This happens in particular in section 1 of the action document, where you're doing sort of the contextual analysis. Often the information on stakeholders was found in PPA, etc., etc. So information being there, but put in the wrong place. Similar sort of inconsistency and overlap of information between the different subsections. Then interestingly, a very weak area was the issue of, you know, lessons learned and coordination, etc. So what you would find would be references to lessons learned or the work being carried out by other projects or by previously funded EU actions in that sector, being referred to in certain parts of the document, but in the LL section, the lessons learned section, not being picked up on. Similarly, risks identified, for example, in context, not being sort of picked up on in the relevant section, section 2 of the action document. So this kind of disjointed approach, so not linking up the different sections of the document. Action not, you know, action, when I say action, that's section 4.1, so description of the overall objectives, etc. Not really linking with the previous analysis on risks, or not really linking with the previous analysis on lessons learned. Now this one, the link between the focus of the action. So focus of the action is within section 1.1.3. this is where you really zoom in on the problematic to be addressed by an action, or the rationale, if you like. And that is really the crux of the action document. And often, you know, you didn't find a clear link between that supposed rationale and the other sections of the document. Other documents were just very disjointed. The links between the different sections weren't clear. And quite surprisingly, in the case of follow-up actions, so phase 2, phase 3, etc., rather disappointing, you didn't have lessons learned from a preceding phase informing design of a subsequent phase. I just need to click on the next slide there, sorry. Okay, so okay, so I think this is a key sort of a representation of the action document, and sort of the way we're visualizing it is the context, the contextual analysis, be that it's a regional program, let's say, or a national context, whatever the overall context is. There should be an overall analysis of that, which then leads us into identifying clearly what the priority areas of support are going to be for this particular action. So in other words, within the contextual analysis, you're going to identify a whole series of weaknesses and difficulties and problems, etc. You are then going to have a look at risks and lessons learned, etc., these other sort of issues, and then decide on what the actual priority area for support is of this action. So here we're kind of thinking in terms of EU added value. What area is EU support going to concentrate on and why? And then this should lead to the development of your intervention logic. What are you going to do and how are you going to do it? That is all encapsulated in your intervention logic, which is section 4.3. So in terms of, if you have your template there beside you, it's sort of moving from section 1.1, then you move into 1.1.3. This is your priority areas for support, and then finally 4.3 is your intervention logic, your description of what you're doing. So this should really be very clear. All the other sections that I've put outside, sort of complementarity, synergy, they feed into that, but this is the main sort of axis, or the core part of your action document, where you should it should be fully clear. Obviously then, once you have your intervention logic, you develop your results chain and your log frame matrix. I'm wondering whether I will take a break there, Lucy, just to see if there's anybody out there, and see if people are understanding me, or indeed if anybody has any questions. So I hand over to you, Lucy.
Thank you. So I didn't see anybody raise their hands or put anything in the boxes, but right now I've lost the participants box. Is there anybody that would like to ask a question at this point? So let me see. Okay, Eric, thank you. It all makes sense. So perhaps, Karen, we should continue if at this point no one has any questions.
Okay, perfect. Now, I don't think you can see me, guys. I don't know whether that's necessarily a bad thing, but it might be a bit strange. I think we're working on it, Fuad, or will I just carry on? Okay, I shall just carry. Sorry about this, guys. A technical blip. Okay, so that is sort of the overall general findings. Now, here we go into looking at the different sections of the action document. So as you recall, I said there were 9 sections that were common across the 31 action documents that I looked at. So what's interesting here is, of the 9, let's have a look. Blue is complying with instructions, orange not complying with instructions, and gray partially complying with instructions. So what we see immediately is action documents were more likely to comply with instructions in the sector analysis of contextual information 1.1 and 1.1.1 PPA and EU policy analysis. They were less likely to comply in the section 3 complementarity synergy. You can see 68% of action documents in the sample deemed to not comply with instructions, which is really quite a lot. Also, I know there's a couple of you out there who work quite a lot on the cross-cutting issues, Eric, Sarah, etc. That also was an area, as you probably know, that did not do very well either in terms of complying with instructions. Then LFM, it's a bit peculiar. What you really have is there's very few that are fully compliant with the instructions for developing a log frame matrix, and very few that are completely not complying with instructions, but you have a huge 80% basically that only partially comply with instructions. So this gives you a sort of an overall view of how the degree, should I say, the degree to which the analyzed action documents complied with instructions for the 9 sections that were common to all of them. Okay, so let's have a quick look now at some of these findings in a little bit more detail. So as we've just seen, the sections most frequently complied with instructions are 1.1, so the country or the regional or the sector analysis, the overall analysis, let's say, depending on what the action is relating to, and the PPA and EU policy framework. So 52% of action documents in both cases complied with the instructions in the template. The sections most frequently classified as not consistent with instructions, as we've just seen, complementarity, synergy, donor coordination at 68% and cross-cutting at 61%. We just saw that in the overall graph. So let's have a look at contextual analysis here. It's interesting that even though it's the area or the section of the document that most frequently is consistent with instructions, there are variations across the different subsections. And in particular, the main the main problem we found was the breakdown of information between the different sections related to contextual analysis. So you have the overall context, then you have stakeholder analysis, and the priority areas for action are not being grasped. And there's often an overlap of information put in the wrong place. In particular, as I said, this whole area of the priority area for support, so section 1.1.3 is really key to get that clear. What exactly within this whole context of different problematics, what exactly is this action going to tackle? That really has to be very clear for the whole action to sort of hang together. And what we found was that there's often, it's basically section 1.1.3 is basically repeating or just simply complementing, providing additional information to somewhere else in the document rather than zooming in on the scope of the action. The reason I put that in inverted commas is because that is what you are asked to do in the instructions template. You will see that it very clearly states, that you need to zoom in on the scope of the action in this section. So this is what we found when we looked at section 1. Let's look here now at some of the more detailed weaknesses, let's say, in the contextual analysis in section 1.1. So here what we found was, you'll see these different bars. This is sort of the number of ADs displaying this weakness. So let's go through some of these. Section left blank, no information provided at all. So here, covering issues that should be addressed elsewhere, so information in the wrong place, including irrelevant information. This is quite common. Now, if you look, you have a good example, project Y, and a bad example, project X. If you had, I don't know whether you have time to look at these, but if you just look at the section 1.1 of your Y document. This is basically a program about TVT, vocational educational training. However, a lot of the context sector information is relating to the overall economic situation, which is fine, but it's not really relevant to the action or doesn't really relate in any way to the action at hand. So for example, we're discussing, I don't know, inflation is high in Y, though it did decline from 11.3% at the close of 2013 to 8.1% in June, mainly due to easing of inflation, etc. I mean, this is a making up document, obviously, just to stress the point. The information is valid, but it's not relevant to this particular action. So we came across this quite a bit, or very generic observations that don't really lead to a better understanding of the action at hand. If you just think that, you know, this is a short document. In total, you can only, I think it's 17 pages, if I'm not mistaken, is the maximum length of the document. You really don't want to be reading through action documents with superfluous or generic observations. You really want to use this space to clearly explain the context and the priority being tackled by this particular action. So there should be no irrelevant information. There should be no generic type observations. Another issue we came across was this tendency to be purely descriptive rather than analytical. So just describing a situation without really going into the causes of the problematic that would then lead nicely to the justification or the rationale for the action. No reference to RBA. This is a requirement in this section, according to the instructions, that there should be a reference at this point in time to RBA. Very few of the action documents analyzed did actually make any reference to RBA, and as I said, section left blank. So these are the kind of weaknesses that were found in section 1.1. Then here we go, PPA. I don't know if any of my colleagues out there are part of the PPA training team and EU policy framework, but the kind of weaknesses we found here. Now, where am I getting these from? You might be asking yourselves, why is she deciding on credibility of policy, coherence with budget, existing institutional framework? This is coming, it was a very mechanical exercise, as I said. This is coming absolutely from the instructions document. So if you look at section 1.1.1, public policy assessment in the EU policy framework, the instructions, how to complete this section during identification, you will see that this is what's requested. Assess today's relevance and credibility, whether the public policy is credible, whether it's coherent with the government's budget, local ownership, existing institutional capacity, sector coordination mechanisms. So in other words, this is where I'm getting my criteria to assess the degree of consistency. It's coming directly from the instructions in the template. So if we look at this graph here, we can see, for example, this one here, existing institutional capacities not being referred to sufficiently in the document, sector coordination mechanisms not being referred to. This is really important if you're trying to establish the credibility of policy. This is a really key issue, the outcomes of effective policy implementation. So here again, these are the weaknesses that were most common in section 1.1.1 PPA and EU policy framework. Here in certain cases we had no reference at all, and 5 of the 31 no reference at all to partner country policies, which is rather peculiar. And in, let's see, what would that be, about 7 or 8 of them, no reference at all to the EU policy framework. So, and just one thing I'd like to clarify, when I say here, this is like for credibility policy, when I put that there, that means there was no reference whatsoever to whether the policy was credible or not. It was just a question of, you know, in certain cases listing the different policies in place without any real analysis of whether they're credible or what sort of funding has been allocated, what are the capacities, etc. Okay, so stakeholder analysis. The main sort of weaknesses found here, again, this sort of appears in a lot of the criteria. Overlapping is putting information in here that has already been dealt with in previous sections or should be dealt with in other areas. In this section, stakeholder analysis, you know, what we did find is that there's a tendency to just list the different entities involved in an action. So no real analysis of, you know, do they have the capacity to assume their mandate? No assessment of working relationship with government of non-governmental entities. No reference to vulnerable groups, for example, not clear on the difference between target groups and beneficiaries. Even here we had like leaving out key stakeholders, not referred to at all. So these are the overall the sort of weaknesses we discovered or came across, should I say, in section 1.1.2. This one here, quite worrying, is, you know, they're specifically requested to refer to stakeholder support or provide evidence of stakeholder support to the proposed action. And look at this, 12 of the action documents that were analyzed did not provide any evidence of stakeholder support to design. So even though it's explicitly requested in the instructions. So this is perhaps the last one I will do before we take a break. So this, as I said earlier, key area, you have absolutely got to be clear on the area that is going to be supported by this action. So this is really your rationale key. If you remember the graph I showed you earlier, this part of the axis, the main axis to fully understand your sort of the action document holds together, is what is the priority area for this particular action. So what did we find here? In an awful lot of cases, look at this, 15, so 50% basically, not identifying key areas for support. So basically not doing what this section is basically requesting. Here again, sort of, you know, general contextual information describing the problematic, etc., but not really zooming in on this is what our project is going to do and why. So the added value of EU support to this particular problem area. Not justifying the choice of priority areas, for saying we're going to work in, I don't know, the construction and tourism sectors, but like no real explanation of, well, why those two sectors, for example. Here again, the template or the instructions for template completion ask you to refer or ask the authors of the action document to refer to gender policies and human rights policies within the country. This is not very rarely done here. And what is quite worrying is, in addition to not clearly identifying the priority area for support, also not linking with the proposed actions. So what's being described here is not being followed through in section 4.1 of your action document, where you're stating what your objectives and expected results are, etc. Again, overlapping with information with other sections, putting information here that should not be here. And okay, this is not really a big issue, one case, text left blank. Okay, Lucy is signaling that there's a couple of questions, so we might take a break. Okay, no, I'm actually going to carry on is what I'm going to do. Okay, sorry.